July, gee, hard to believe it's July, is in the church, it's considered the kind of the month of Saints Joachim and Anna, because this is when we observe the feast of the Dormition of Saint Anna, the death of Saint Anne, and so it has of course some questions, because obviously we don't know about Saint Anne and Joachim. We don't know about them from the Gospels, but rather there's a different connection, which I think sometimes we're not aware of, especially if we haven't studied that period of early Christian literature, because it is a period that also produced a lot of heretical texts. So many times there's almost a fear about diving too deeply into those earlier texts, because it might be a heretical text. And that is, it's definitely something that could indeed happen. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. But I'd like to begin with prayer, using specifically from the Vespers of the Feast of the Conception by Saint Anna, which in the Byzantine and Orthodox churches is observed on December 9th. And because, of course, these hymns come from the text that we're going to learn about this evening. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The barren Anna leaped for joy when she gave birth to Mary the Virgin, who will in turn give birth in the flesh to God, the Word. Overflowing with happiness, she cried out, "Rejoice for me, all tribes of Israel, for I have given birth according to the will of God, my benefactor, who answered my prayer and wiped out my shame. According to his promise, he has healed the pains of my heart through the pains of birth-giving. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. He who made waters gush from a rock permitted your womb to carry Mary, the ever-Virgin, Our Lady, through whom our salvation will come. You were delivered from shame. No longer will you be on earth as a fruitless earth, for you will give birth to an earth that will bring forth the tree of life. According to his will, he delivered the human race from all shame when he put on our human form and became man, for he is rich in mercy, now and ever and forever. Amen. Behold, the promises of the prophets are realized, for the holy mountain is planted in the womb. The divine ladder is set up, the great throne of the King is ready. The place for the passage of the Lord is prepared. The dry bush that fire cannot consume is blossoming, and the treasure house of sanctifying grace is like an abundant flow of blessings that heal the barrenness of Anna, whom we glorify with faith. These hymns begin the you could say the veneration of Saint Anna, based on a text that comes to us from the first centuries of Christianity. Now, there are many texts that are considered apocryphal, and some of them are good, and some are heretical. Some of them have content which may be somewhat dubious. Some are problematic, and we've heard these different titles that are kind of thrown around when talking about early Christian literature. And I don't know if when you follow like the hot topics in the on websites and in the newspapers, so it's been kind of a trend that almost every year around Lent and Easter, that some bigger news outlet will release the story of the discovery of the Gospel of Judas, or the Gospel of Saint Mary Magdalene, and they're saying that everyone in the Vatican is afraid because this completely shatters all ideas about Christ that the church has been teaching for 2,000 years, and usually, it's clickbait, so a lot of people go and click on it, and become at best distracted. They get a little bit of fodder for their doubts, and some people, of course, who are illiterate about their own faith and as well as the gospel tradition, yes, they may be at a loss. They may actually be shocked. But most Christians who have even a basic catechetical background and understanding of the gospel tradition and how tradition was formed within the church, they can kind of figure out that, okay, there are usually some key words. And very often, one of those key words is Gnostic. And so when you see that, although the headline may read Gospel of Judas, when you go into the text, so very often you'll find Gnostic Gospel, or that it came from the Gnostic movement. And these Gospels are nothing new. They're not Gospels, they're pseudo-Gospels. They're considered part of like these, in generic term, Apocryphal Gospels. However, it depends on your perspective, because Apocryphal Gospels within the context of the Christian approach to literature, those Gospels or those texts are of value. And so these would be pseudo-Gospels, pseudo being fake, false. And there are many texts like that. So for example, this text is a collection of the different books that were discovered in Egypt. It is the new translation of the Gnostic scriptures in one volume, the Naj Hammadi library. And so this, if we want to put in good Catholic terms, this book should be burned. However, for reasons of study and context, especially when it comes to history, the text is interesting. Of course, it presents a faith that is somewhat contaminated by ancient Egyptian belief. And that's Gnosticism comes, of course, from the context of Egypt. However, there are other books. There are books such as the Lost Books of the Bible, which I see Gwen has. And I happen to have a text which is in Italian, which is the Apocryphal Gospels. Nice thick little book that contains within it different translations. Some are of the same gospel or Apocryphal Gospel, but translated from like Greek or Arabic, where there might be differences. And then many of them are just points of reference. So, for example, you've got, of course, the primary text is the Proto-Evangelion of Saint James. Then you've got the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Matthew, and these are Gospels not in the sense of accepted canonical Gospels, but rather these are the Apocryphal ones. And then it goes on to include things such as the Syriac Apocryphal Gospel of the infancy of Jesus, or the Gospel of Nicodemus. And if you remember when we talked about the descent into Hades, and how that is, of course, a big theme in iconography also. It is the first resurrection. So the descent into Hades comes from the Gospel of Nicodemus, or the Apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus. Now, the problem, of course, the biggest problem is that it starts to get confusing. So when you're, I try to remember to say, to call it Proto-Evangelion of James, but very often it just comes out as gospel. It's easy to say that, and so don't get it confused with the Gospels as we preserve them in the church, the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But so let's begin. I sent out the text of the Proto-Evangelion of James, and it's a version that when you read it, you may have had a little bit of difficulty because it is a more literal, poetic version as opposed to a fluid, spoken English version. Like we read the Gospels, and the Gospels that we read in church are most often quite colloquial. So the expressions and the words used are familiar to us. And, and Jesus doesn't speak in these and thous and, like a real formalized, archaic English. Now, we may have that in our own Bibles at home. We may have an older Bible that does have that English, but the Gospels have been translated and retranslated, and even as we sit here together this evening, the Gospels are definitely somewhere in the English-speaking world right now being retranslated again, because there are many different translations. They loosely connect because, like Protestant scripture, Protestant gospel translation will follow most commonly King James in English. And so there is a certain continuity, but it is reflective of English changing and the understanding of the language changing. And so it makes it a little more difficult then. With this text, there are a number of versions of it in English, and it would probably be a good idea for someone to sit down with the Greek text and actually make a new translation into English, which is more colloquial. However, and to that end, I kind of picked this one because it was a middle translation. It was formal, but still very understandable. And some of the things, don't worry if there are some things that you didn't understand within the text, like, some of the things that are said in the conversations. It's reflective of the veiled language that is also used in the text. So not everything is stated blatantly and very clearly, but rather some of it is meant to be ambiguous and mysterious, and so to encourage the reader then to read it again. What is being said, what is being shown to us through this text. So the Gospel of James, the Proto-Evangelion of James or Saint James, the Infancy Gospel of James, the Proto-Evangelium of James. Proto-Evangelion is Greek, Proto-Evangelium is Latin. And so all these different names are given to this one text, which is an apocryphal gospel, not recognized as part of the canon of the church. Apocryphal gospel has already a little bit of a little bit of baggage with it, where some people assume that it is fabled, mythological, or heretical, and it is not exclusively. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Depends on which gospel you look at. This Proto-Evangelion of James was written down. So how do we figure out, when it was written? And that is done through stylistic observations. So looking at the Greek text, which perhaps was the original text, but it's not sure. It's also possible that Aramaic was the original language. But either way, looking at one of these translations, and I believe for the dating, the Greek translation was looked at. So we can ascertain which period of time it was composed because of the way that the Greek was written, the forms of the words, and also the phrasing, how Greek language has changed. And so it is not necessarily from the period of the Gospels, but it is shortly after the composing of the Gospels. So most experts will give it at earliest, will date it to about 130 after the birth of Christ. And the latest date that it has gotten is about 170. So we're looking at a 40-year window when the text would have been brought together. And it fills in some of the lacking stories about Jesus's background. Why would this be important? Well, within the context of Middle Eastern Jewish society, and also the curiosity of new Christians who were converting from paganism, there was an interest to know Jesus's background. Where is his lineage? Who does he come from? Tribal connections. All of these things were very important to make sure that his foundations were indeed in sync and in harmony with the Old Testament and with the prophets. And so this text provides us a lot of information about Mary, about her background, and also gives us a lot of doctrinal information. So one of the, there are of course some issues. So even though the text has a number of things of great value for the church's tradition and for aspects that have become a part of the church's teaching, there are also some condemnations. And you know, so it's interesting to look at that also, because it's a part of how this text was received and then what it means. So sometimes the condemnations make it seem that this text in and of itself is being rejected wholesale. And that's not the issue. The issue was that in the experience of the early church, the canon of the Gospels was not actually promulgated and accepted until almost the mid-4th century. So under the reign of Constantine, Saint Constantine. And that means that anything before the year 330 that bore the name of an apostle, that had some connection to Jesus, was considered a possible gospel text. And so the apocryphal Gospel of St. James was one of these texts that could possibly have become a part of the canon of the 4 Gospels that we have today: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so because of that, some of the early church fathers were pretty vociferous. They were pretty loud about their objections to the text. And one of the fathers that we have really a lot of information from is Origen. Origen was a theologian and philosopher from Alexandria who was a prolific teacher of the faith, who wrote and preached and expressed the teachings of the church. He lived at a time when the church was still persecuted, and actually he himself, although he wasn't a martyr, in his life, his greatest desire was to be a martyr. And at the end of his life, he died in the year 254. At the end of his life, he was arrested and severely beaten. And eventually, about 3 years after that arrest and beating, he died as a result of the injuries that were sustained. So he was, to the understanding of the church, you could say that he was indeed a martyr. But Origen also is a little problematic because he was from Alexandria, and he worked as a catechist, but a theological catechist of great quality. And he ran afoul of his bishop, the patriarch, and ended up being ordained a priest by a bishop from another diocese, and that drove his hometown bishop crazy. He really railed against him and condemned him, and I think some of that even has caused the dark cloud that remains over the person of Origen. So even though he's technically considered a father of the church, he is not canonized. He is not. There isn't a Saint Origen. So, but he is the one who wrote about the text of the Proto-Evangelion, and he is quoted very often by other fathers who come after him, including Saint Jerome. Origen considered the text untrustworthy, and he questioned its origins, and the connection to St. James. He also did refer to it as, in his opinion, heretical. And so that was, that's a pretty sharp assessment of the text. And this was also reiterated by different local councils of the church that had problems with the text because it was a popular text. So the accusation of heresy doesn't really come up, not in its full force. Even Pope Gelasius in the 5th century refers to the text as one to be avoided. So he very carefully words his opinion of the text without calling it heretical. And again, the problem is probably in its popularity, because it was an approachable text that gave a lot of background to Jesus, and also provided information about Mary's upbringing, her family life, and really gave another dimension to her in the life of the church. And the early church did have a lot of difficulties with the person of Mary, especially for Gentiles converting to Christianity, where they were coming out of a background that had multiple gods, and gods had children who were gods or demigods, and so Mary and Jesus kind of fit conveniently into this pagan worldview, and so not understanding fully an orthodox theological approach to Christ, many early Christians became a little bit confused, and they were drawn more to the person of Mary because she was a mother, because she was a very sympathetic figure, because she functioned as a mother, because she was a widow, because she lost a son. So there was a lot of different things that rendered Mary more approachable. And of course, even ideas, even grasping the idea, well, Jesus Christ is God. However, instead of praying directly to Jesus, that there was the idea you could pray to Mary, pray to his mother, and then she'll get to him. And now that's a part of even popular piety today. However, in the early church, that was dangerous, because as Christianity was beginning to grow, there was a distinct possibility that heresy could develop. And Mary was one of those easy places where early Christians could become distracted and their focus be taken away from Jesus. Now that's reflected in what becomes a tradition of the church beginning in the 5th century, that depictions of Mary, so in iconography or decoration of churches, any depiction of Mary was to include Jesus, or was to be somehow in relationship with an image of Jesus. And so that becomes, that I think that's evidence that we have to show some of this process. And also then it justifies a little bit of that rejection of this Proto-Evangelion, because it was focused more on Mary than it was focused on Jesus. And so in the condemnation of the text, the condemnation consists more of an assessment of its value in relationship to texts that are focused on Jesus Christ. So in that relationship, this is a throwaway text because it's not the gospel. It is not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, as a text that fills in other details, it does have a lot of value for us. And so that's one of the things that I would like to focus on, actually, are some of the things that this text establishes for the church. So there are a number of things that we celebrate in the church, that we believe in the church, that if this text was not available to us, it would not be the same. So firstly, this text gives us the names of Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna. They're not mentioned in any earlier text. This is the first text that specifically mentions them by name and speaks in very detailed terminology of their preparation to become the parents of Mary. Then, secondly, the text also gives us 3 feasts. There are 3 feasts of the church that are tied to the Proto-Evangelion of James. So the conception of Mary, which in the Western Church is now defined, and so it bears the name of the Immaculate Conception, and whereas in the Eastern churches it is known as the Conception by Saint Anna. And then the second feast is the birth of Mary. And the third feast is the presentation of the Mother of God in the temple. And so to go back to some of the dating of this, the conception by Saint Anna is celebrated in the Eastern churches on December 9th, in the Western Church on December 8th. And that is from the Feast of the Conception to the birth. It is exactly 9 months in the reckoning of the Western Church. Whereas in the early church and also in the Eastern churches, the 9 months is off by 1 day. And so it is 9 months minus a day for Mary. For John the Baptist, conception and birth, which are also celebrated, is 9 months plus a day. And Jesus's birth is exactly 9 months, from Annunciation to Nativity. And so, and that was the early church's way of saying that Jesus's birth was perfect, because when we're dealing with God, perfection is always a part of the experience. Whereas both Mary and John are human beings. And so hence the figuring out of the timing from conception to birth, it doesn't always work out perfectly to 9 months. And so that's why it's off. So those three feasts are on the calendar. Then the next point that we have is the whole history of the betrothal to Joseph. And, that's beautifully written out and expressed within the Proto-Evangelion. The next information which we have also, and this is not, these are details, is the nativity of Christ. There are some details that are preserved in the Proto-Evangelion that both reflect the gospel tradition and also add to the gospel tradition. So, for example, that Jesus was born in a stable that happened to be a cave, as opposed to a stable that happened to be a freestanding building. And so those things are important details that in the early church, like if you go to look up the oldest images or sculptures, reliefs of the Nativity of Jesus, in all of those you're going to find a cave. So, but it's a cave that was used as a stable for animals. And so, however, in the gospel tradition, it's not so specific, whereas in the Proto-Evangelion, it is specific. And, then I think probably one of the most important doctrinal gleanings that we get from the text of the Proto-Evangelion is the perpetual virginity of the Mother of God. This is the earliest Christian text that clearly shows that the early church recognized that the Mother of God, that Mary, was a virgin before the birth of Christ, during the birth of Christ, and after the birth of Christ. And so, that's a very foundational document. So for some of those who had condemned the text, again, their condemnation, other than Origen, their condemnation was very careful about just how they worded that condemnation, because this text held a lot of information that has become a part of the church's teaching, the church's theology, and the church's faith. Now, the Proto-Evangelion as an apocryphal gospel does what apocryphal gospels very often do. It takes some factual information, some faith information, and then embellishes it a little bit. And so, what would I be specifically referring to? Well, there's a number of things. Firstly, the attribution to Saint James, the brother of the Lord. The Eastern churches accept as a part of tradition that Joseph was an older man. He was not a young man. He was not of the same age as Mary. And he was a widower who had at least a son that would be St. James. And so technically, according to the way we understand, blood relations, James would not be related by blood to Jesus. So he wouldn't be a half-brother, but he would be a step-brother. However, within Judaism, these kinds of arrangements, where a wife died in childbirth or from some illness, there was a very high mortality rate. So it wouldn't be unusual for a man to remarry, or even for a woman to remarry. And so blended families were a common reality amongst the Jewish people. And so the legislation, the laws, stated very clearly, because, for family peace and harmony, parents, especially in a second marriage, could not play favorites. And so they became, even had they not borne the children as a mother or been the father biologically, when they marry, they become the father and the mother in the fullest sense, rendering then all the children that they bring into the marriage as being fully brothers and sisters. And so all of the laws about intermarriage and things like that, all of that was in play. And so it's no surprise then that James would be referred to as the brother of the Lord, as opposed to, the stepbrother of the Lord. And and the fact that he's referred to specifically as the brother is also kind of important, because the Gospels don't tend to mix up terms. So they could have said cousin. St. John is referred to as cousin. Elizabeth is referred to as a kinswoman, not a sister. And so, the terminology is very specific. But nonetheless, even with this kind of a connection, the attribution to St. James is probably not accurate for a couple of reasons. Firstly, some of the things that are described in the Proto-Evangelion are strange for Judaism. Things that would not be a part of Jewish tradition of Jesus's time and of that period of the 2nd century, or rather of the 1st century. And so, some of those details are, like, for example, the fact that Mary would have been left as a child at the temple with other virgins who dedicated themselves to doing specific tasks within the temple. And for Mary specifically was to weave the curtain that would be placed in the Holy of Holies around the Ark of the Covenant. So the strange part was that this idea of, like, temple virgins, which was not to be found in Judaism, is something that was found in ancient Roman religion. And so that is a detail which seems to be contrived or imported. But I would say my opinion on this is that this is more of, it's been rendered into a theological story. So I don't think that it was meant to be read as at face value, as, Mary was taken into the temple and left there by her parents so that she could grow up in this holy place. I don't think it was meant to be read at face value, but I think it was a theological story, and I'll get to that a little later. The other thing, many of these early texts, as well as other stories, and this persists for almost 1,000 years, and actually even beyond, Many stories within the early church try to create a pedigree that would connect them as closely as possible to Jesus. And, so perhaps this apocryphal gospel is a reflection on maybe it was James who told this story to somebody, and so that's how his name was associated. Or maybe it was just, a collection of early stories taken from family, from people who were around Jesus. We don't really know. However, I think the important thing to say is that this text in no way was meant to be deceptive. It was not created as some sort of a contrived fairy tale to distract from the Gospels. It was really created to serve the church in spreading the good news and providing context. And this is where I would like to say something about the theological use of story. The whole story about Mary being brought into the temple is not reflected within Jewish tradition. And so I assume that you all have read the text of the Proto-Evangelion or parts of it. And if not, you can read it afterwards. It's not a long text. And it does read rather well as a story. And just to give you a little bit of a context, so it is divided into 3 sections, literarily speaking. Each section consists of 8 chapters. And don't be afraid, you're not talking about some huge thick book like this. The chapters are short. They're not very long. And the first section of 8 chapters contains the story of the birth of Mary to Anna and her childhood and her dedication to the temple. The second part, so from chapter 9 until chapter 18 or 16, begins when Mary is 12 years old and goes all the way through to her betrothal to Saint Joseph. And then the final part of 8 chapters, from chapter 17 to 24, relates the nativity of Jesus, the midwives, Jesus being hidden from Herod, and then also there is reference to John the Baptist. And so these 3 sections, the first part, of course, talking about Joachim and Anna and their hopes to have a child. They are well-to-do Jerusalem people who live close to the temple, and Joachim spends as much time as he can in the temple praying. His offering is seemingly rejected by one of the priests at the temple, throwing Joachim into a fit of depression. And that affects his relationship with Anna. And he goes to the desert, and one can kind of put 2 and 2 together to understand that his retreating to the desert was an attempt to die. So he could not commit suicide, but he had lost the will to live. So he put himself into circumstances that might cost him his life. And Anna reacts to that with her lamentation, which is one of the high points of the actual text. I would like to look at that specifically because it is and it's in chapter 2. And so this is Anna's lamentation. I shall bewail my widowhood. So she recognized that Joachim was basically despondent and had given up hope. I shall bewail my childlessness, and the great day of the Lord was at hand. And Judith, her maidservant, said, how long do you humiliate your soul? Behold, the great day of the Lord is at hand, and it is unlawful for you to mourn. And then Anna says, depart from me, for I have not done such things, and the Lord has brought me very low. So her maidservant gives her a trinket, kind of a gift to console her. And her reaction to it is, it's a turning point for her, where she too was in that same depression of Joachim. But that pity that she received from her servant, that, she who is blessed with a comfortable life, a loving husband, living close to the temple, all these blessings that she has, and the servant girl actually pities her, that causes this reaction in her. And she goes and changes her garments of mourning, cleans her head, puts on her wedding garments, which is wedding garments. It's not she didn't dress up as a bride, but rather she dressed in clothes that one would wear to a wedding, so festive clothing. And there she prays, O God of our fathers, bless me and hear my prayer as you bless the womb of Sarah and gave her a son. And the prayer continues. So the prayer it's not in one single swoop, rather it's abbreviated or punctuated through different movements and emotional experiences. And I think that's one of the reasons also why in the Eastern churches, the feast is referred to as the conception by Saint Anna, and not the conception by Saint Anna and Joachim. We recognize that, it takes two for them to have Mary. However, I think that the church also recognizes her fortitude, that she snapped out of it and was able to turn herself around and focus her prayer to God so that he would hear them. And so the church recognizes that in her, that strength of character and faith, where her husband was weak and despondent. And so no doubt, with this kind of a background for Mary, no doubt that the child that they had would be told and reminded and taught that she was a miracle child. She was the answer to their prayers, and that indeed her birth, her conception, saved Joachim's life and saved their marriage. And so, all those details would have been a part of Mary's upbringing from, the very first steps she made. And indeed, we see that reflected. And I think that's where this illustrative storytelling, where Anna wants to take the child to the temple and leave the child there. And it wasn't because of abandoning the child. It was her sense of unworthiness before this miracle. And so she knew that this child was great in the eyes of God. She knew that this child was uniquely blessed. And so for both her as well as Joachim, Mary was uniquely special, and I think that is expressed in the Proto-Evangelion through this whole idea of bringing her to the temple. Now, according to Jewish tradition, so Jesus was presented in the temple, and that follows Jewish law, that especially the first male child had to be offered in the temple. And in the same way that Abraham offered his son. And so the child Jesus was brought to the temple and offered through prayers, so not sacrificed, but a sacrifice in his stead would be offered. And for a poor couple like Mary and Joseph, that was 2 turtle doves. And those are the turtle doves that we see in the icon of the presentation of Jesus in the temple. Usually they are either in a cage held by Joseph or seated on his arm. And, so there would be nothing required of Joachim and Anna, no offering of thanksgiving required by the law for their having a child. However, being pious as they were, and Joachim especially was very pious, there's no doubt that they would have offered something to the temple. They would have gone to the temple and in the gratitude for having this child. Now, the bigger theological storytelling occurs a little later. The theological storytelling comes in when Mary is actually left at the temple. And so this is the feast of the presentation of Mary in the temple, also known in the Eastern churches. It is known as the entrance of the Mother of God into the temple. And this feast, Mary is depicted usually in the iconography as being a young girl, somewhere, could say maybe between 6 and 10 years old, roughly. And she is brought there specifically to weave this curtain that would be hanging around God's presence in the Ark of the Covenant. Those signs in the Holy of Holies and the inner sanctum of the temple that would be that hold all of those the evidence of God's relationship with the people of Israel. And, so it's a very nice story. And, and it shows Mary's unique place in this history of salvation and the unfolding of the mystery of the incarnation. However, because as I said, the tradition of temple virginity is not from Judaism, and and some of these things seem to be a little bit strange and contrived. So what is this about? Or where does this come out of? Well, so this text is coming together around the year 130 to 170, that period. 50 years before that, the city of Jerusalem was razed to the ground. And specifically, the temple and the Temple Mount the temple was destroyed, and the Temple Mount was desecrated. The Romans made sure that the city of Jerusalem would be unfit for the presence of God according to Jewish usage and law. And so they offered on the Temple Mount, on the foundation of the temple, they sacrificed pigs, who were the dirtiest of animals. And the blood of pigs was put over everything that was considered sacred for the Jewish people. So this desecration was meant to be annihilating. It was meant to be a final, terminal blow to the presence of God among the people of Israel. And it was also supposed to punish the Jewish people for their rebellion against the Romans. Think about Masada. And so the rebellion against the Romans could no longer be tolerated. And so this was a way that the Romans chose to destroy the identity of the Jewish people. So how does that affect Jews? How does it affect early Christians? Well, with the loss of this focal point, and even the early church, the apostles, Jesus himself prayed at the temple. For early Christians, Judaism was the context that in order to understand Jesus, we just celebrated the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. And, one of the things I had mentioned about them, which makes their feast very ironic, is the fact that they didn't quite get along. And it was, you could say maybe there was some personality issue, but there also was a very practical issue of apostolic evangelization. One of the things being discussed in the early Judeo-Christian church was if Gentile converts to Christianity needed to come through Judaism. Because after Pentecost, the early church still was firmly rooted within Judaism. And they considered themselves to be the fulfillment of the messianic promise, of the messianic hope. And so they had not separated themselves from Judaism completely. So much so that in the 120s, so 50 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the forced exodus of Jews from Jerusalem, the rabbis, the Jewish rabbis gathered in northern Galilee, who were creating a way of being Jewish without the temple. And so, and that's what we call that rabbinic Judaism, because the rabbis are not priests. The priests are attached to the temple. Temple destroyed, no more priesthood. The rabbis are simply the teachers. And so rabbinic Judaism is the post-temple form of Judaism. And the parts of the legislating that the rabbis made was against Christians. And specifically, they created laws saying that no followers of the Nazarene can belong to a synagogue. So what does that mean? Well, you make laws when there are problems. And so that means that many of the Jews who had converted who had seen in Jesus the fulfillment of the Messianic hope, still identified as Jews and still participated in synagogues. And we know that's true because there are a few places where we have early Christian churches that underneath the church there are archaeological remains of a synagogue. And so many of some of these communities were Jewish communities that came to recognize in Jesus the Messiah. And so the going back to the feast of the presentation of Mary in the temple, that feast is not actually the celebration of a historical event, but rather it is the church in the person of Saint James, the brother of the Lord, whoever brought this text together. It is their attempt to show that the continuity of the temple has not been disturbed. That even before the temple was destroyed in the year 70, that Mary as a child who was brought into the temple, and that was that meeting between the Old Testament temple and the New Testament temple, coming face to face. And Mary was that bridge between the old and the new. And so what she was doing in this physical labor of weaving a curtain, and just a note on the icons of the Annunciation, you'll find Mary is holding yarn, or she has like a spool in her hand, or it's fallen next to the chair where she's sitting. So that is showing that act of weaving the curtain that would be for the Holy of Holies. However, the weaving was also a symbolic way of saying that she was cultivating within her own life, within her womb. She held within her God. And so the Holy of Holies from the temple is now being succeeded by the Holy of Holies that is the womb of Mary, the Mother of God. And so as she creates this veil around the Holy of Holies, so her body is also that veil that is around Jesus, who is forming in her womb. And so that feast then of the entrance of the Mother of God, or the presentation of the Mother of God, is really to be taken for its theological value, because it presents to us a very clear understanding that that sanctuary of the temple, that building, that did not contain God, but rather was the footstool of heaven. It contained the proof, those items such as the tablets of the law, the Ark of the Covenant, the rod of Aaron, the manna from the desert. All these things were proof of God's relationship with Israel. But the place that had the presence of God did not contain the presence of God. And there is the mystery, that imperfect temple gave way to the perfect temple of the body of the Mother of God that contained completely Jesus Christ, who is God and man, in her womb. And then, from that kind of a theological meditation, and remember, this is, you're talking about 100 years after Pentecost. And so these theological meanderings, thought processes, this is happening as the faith is being taught, but as the faith also is being persecuted. So all of this is being done secretly. The tradition of the Proto-Evangelion is transmitted primarily through oral tradition until it comes together in a written text. And so, similarly to the Gospels, because churches were not places that were built and established as parishes within dioceses, but rather the reality of Christians was a much more fluid reality where their safety and their lives depended on the demeanor of their local political rulers. And of course they were very actively still persecuted. And so, that's a reality which, as a theological reflection, told in a story form, so instead of some biblical text, like even Origen, but after him the fathers, when they write about the teachings of the church and the theology, that can be very dense. Reading the fathers is not like reading a story. However, within the context of first, second century Christianity, underground Christianity, persecuted Christianity, the telling of a story could also be the teaching of theology. And so that's what is done. And that's why the church does recognize the importance of the Proto-Evangelion. So all of those critics and the naysayers from the past, all of that is relatively wiped out. So we know they didn't like it. They had their reasons. However, today, this is a part of the texts of early Christianity, texts that have cast a long shadow, a long theological shadow, texts that have given us very pertinent and important information about, yes, the life of Jesus, his background, but they've also tried to teach faith, teach theology, and provide a foundation for certain teachings, such as the perpetual virginity of the Mother of God, meaning virgin before the birth of Christ, during the birth of Christ, and after the birth of Christ. And just FYI, that is shown in iconography. That is shown by the 3 stars, which we see on the veil of the Virgin. She has a star on one shoulder, then on her head, on the veil, and then on her other shoulder, signifying that she was a virgin before the birth of Christ, during the birth of Christ, and after the birth of Christ. And in images and iconography, this was put in there simply so that it would be taught. So it's not a detail that was an embellishment or a decoration. It wasn't about jewelry, but rather it was put in there out of theological reasons that would then encourage those who pray before the icons to remind themselves what they know, what they have studied, what they have learned. And, I urge you to take a good look at the text, to read it prayerfully. If you have any questions, definitely contact me with the questions. There are many different things that we could talk about, from there. One thing that I would like to point out is, there is talk about the role of Joseph, and in the even in the iconography of the Nativity. So in the earliest iconography of the Nativity, so Joseph is depicted as an older man, much older, and one of the reasons for that is that the understanding, and when you read this in the Proto-Evangelion, it should come out pretty clearly. The understanding was that a young man would want to have children. And so, but Mary was to remain a virgin. She was to be prepared to be that temple of God. And so the priests arranged her marriage to Joseph, who no longer had the libido of a young man. And as an older man, he would be capable of protecting her. And so protecting also her virginity and protecting her from the law, so that when she became pregnant and he wasn't the father, that she would not be exposed to possibility of being stoned to death according to Mosaic law. And also that he would protect the realization of this coming of the Messiah, because the Messiah had to be born legitimate. So he had to have a father, and Joseph gave Jesus that legitimacy. And so his protective role is very clearly shown in the Proto-Evangelion. And actually, that's like one of those parts when you read about the priest scolding Joseph. What did you do? Why did you, get her pregnant? And so he reacts to that, without being fully aware of all of the details and what it meant until the angel comes to him. And so that's why in the oldest images of the Nativity, as well as in the iconography still used in Eastern churches of the Nativity, Joseph is not there in the middle. You got Mary and Jesus, and then removed a little bit is Joseph. I have here this is a copy, a resin copy of a Byzantine ivory carving. The original is from the 13th century. And here at the bottom, you can see right here is Joseph. Here's Mary with Jesus. And then removed is Joseph, who is has that thinking, worrying pose. So he is trying to figure out things, what this is all about, and then the angel comes. And the other interesting thing within this image is the presence of the midwives. And so there are two midwives, just like there are in the gospel, in the Proto-Evangelion. They don't appear in the text of the gospel nativity of Jesus. And so one of these, the one that is holding Jesus right here, this is the one in the text referred to as Salome. And Salome becomes the one who proves that Mary is a virgin after the birth of Jesus. And according to the text, because of her lack of faith when she is told that Mary is a virgin, and so insisting on, and she uses the words of St. Thomas, from the doubting Thomas. And she says she has to probe with her finger to make sure she's a virgin. And that doubt in her caused her hand to wither. And so then when she expresses repentance, so then she is restored by holding Jesus. And so she holds him in the basin where he is washed after his birth. And this is the same Salome who is considered to be one of the myrrh-bearing women, the women who came to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus and who became the witnesses of the resurrection. So there's a lot of intricate connections to the gospel tradition. How deeply these connections run is really a point of conjecture, because we don't have the texts. So when we do like biblical criticism, like in Bible study, you can go much deeper because we have all the commentaries of the fathers. The church focused on the gospels, on verifying their authenticity. But these secondary texts, they don't always get the attention that they could have. And because of that lack of attention, then some of these connections that we can read, they really can't be investigated too deep, because we just don't have the tools to fill in the blanks. You'll notice the same thing. There is reference, of course, to Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. And so he's also the connection. He is one of the priests, and he is referred to as the high priest, but he was not a high priest. He was just one of the regular clergy who served in the temple by lot. But he's another connection that's there. And there's also the connection with he who was the successor. Zechariah was killed by Herod's men because he wouldn't disclose where John the Baptist was hiding as an infant, as a child, was hiding with his mother. And so he was killed in the temple. However, the Zechariah that is also killed in the temple is the prophet Zechariah. And so there's kind of a converging of different stories and histories, which makes it interesting, but also makes it confusing. And then when Zechariah dies, so the temple is entrusted to the high priest, who is Simeon, and that is Simeon the elder, the one who held Jesus when he was presented. So the Proto-Evangelion brings together many of these characters. It confuses perhaps some of the names. It has, taken, I think there's a little bit of liberty taken with theological storytelling. However, the final product has been so impactful in the life of the church that, you know, it's a wonderful text that is worth reading. You know, I share the first part of the text, the first 8 chapters, I usually share with couples who are preparing for marriage, because it offers a beautiful insight into the minds and hearts of Joachim and Anna, and also shows their vulnerability and their issues and their sadness, and yet also witnesses to the strength of Elizabeth to lift them both out of the sadness, to bring Joachim back to her out of the desert so that he would not die there of hunger or from any of the dangers that lurk in the desert, be they natural or be they human. And, you know, and that's the message that the Proto-Evangelion has is, I think, still very real, very pertinent. And it does have to be read in a different way. We're not reading gospel. However, we are reading the experience and the faith of the early apostolic church. And, you know, the connection to the apostles through James, be it in name or be it deeper, we don't know. However, the content, I think, really does redeem the text as being something of great beauty, especially for that phase in the development of the church, and very important. You know, all these images that we have of Mary as, you know, the mother of the church. Think about the litanies. You know, there are litanies to Mary in the Western church. In the Eastern church, there is the Akathist, that is a liturgical hymn that is prayed during Lent, and it lists the different titles of Mary, and that comparison to the temple, showing her to be the successor of the temple, and indeed to be the perfection of the temple. You know, and that's one of the reasons why from the earliest of churches, Mary is placed at the altar. It is not because, you know, she was a priest or some, you know, idea like that, but rather it was because she is the temple. And so when we gather together and we gather in a church, in a building, we still look to Mary as being the prototype. As we make Christ present in our church, as he is in the tabernacle, as he is present in communion during the liturgy. So before all of that, there is Mary. And so it's an important text. So questions, comments, observations. That connection is definitely there. Because the veil is a reference to the presence of God. It is a seamless veil, so it is woven, the room having walls around it, that the curtain is not in pieces, but rather it is woven seamlessly. And so it has no beginning and no end. And I think that even though there is this understanding that Mary is the new temple, the text would almost, it kind of leads you to conclude that once Jesus dies and he is no longer present in that sense of physicality rather it's only his body, that is when the presence of God is no longer among the people of Israel. And so that's why it's connected to the temple. The church is also saying, through this text, is very clearly saying that, Mary, at the point when she was pregnant, she superseded the temple. The temple was a done deal at that point, so it was no longer important. But because the temple walked, in a sense, among the people of Israel, and then Jesus walked as God among the people of Israel. So even though the temple was no longer effective, God was still there in Jesus Christ. And so when he was gone, so then it wiped off everything. So those who rejected Jesus, they rejected the presence of God. It was all like interconnected with one fell swoop. Of course, we want to know more about Jesus. And this has been the Christians from all times really have looked to fill in some of these stories about Jesus's background, Jesus's grandparents, and I think this is one of those texts that really does provide for that, but in the same time, it's really heavy with theology. It's interesting to see Joseph is depicted up until about the 16th century. He's depicted as an older man, and then starting in the late 16th century, there began like a whole spirituality focusing on his fatherhood and what he did, and as a kind of a effect of that spirituality, Joseph becomes younger, and specifically we can see that specifically in Italian art, and then of course he's a very popular saint from that time on of Italy, and so he becomes younger, and it changes a little bit the perception. However, the way that he is seen is that didn't change. And so he still has that role that is about protection and legitimacy of the child. So I look forward to seeing you. I'll be sending out the information as always. If you have any questions, if you have some follow-up that you would like information on, just shoot me an email, and I promise I will get back to you as soon as I can. Okay? Have a good evening.